What you are about to hear is a hypothetical political legal dramatization, a fictionalized Senate hearing designed to explore how power, law, and accountability could collide when the questions are no longer polite and the answers are no longer optional. After this moment, the story proceeds as if everything is real. There are rooms in Washington built not to persuade, but to expose. Room 216 of the Hart Senate Office Building is one of them. The ceilings rise too high for comfort. The wood paneling is dark, heavy, unyielding. Portraits of long-dead senators stare down with the cold patience of history. Men who once believed the Republic could survive anything as long as the rules were followed. American flags flank the dais, not as decoration, but as reminder. This is not a stage. It is a pressure chamber. If you are watching this, understand something immediately. This hearing was never supposed to matter. On paper, it was routine. Refugee resettlement success. A familiar topic. Safe. Predictable. A place for speeches, applause, and carefully edited sound bites. A place where everyone knew their role, and no one asked the wrong questions. That was the plan. The gallery was already divided before the gavel fell. You could feel it the moment the doors opened. On the left, progressive activists, color-coordinated signs, slogans rehearsed for cameras. On the right, veterans in dress uniforms, medals catching the light, posture rigid, silent. Between them, something rarer and far more dangerous. Somali-American refugees who were not activists, not donors, not staffers, people who had lived the process, people who remembered waiting. If you're watching closely, this is where the story really begins, not with the politicians, with the people who know what the system feels like when it works and when it doesn't. Senator Grassley's voice, steady and unremarkable, opened the hearing the way thousands before it had begun. Formalities, jurisdiction, purpose. The words barely registered. Everyone in the room already knew why they were there. Representative Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table, posture composed, expression practiced. She had prepared for this. Talking points memorized, emotional beats planned. She had told her story many times: refugee camp, arrival, opportunity, Congress, the American dream personalized. Across from her, at a deliberate angle, sat Vice President J.D. Vance. If you are expecting theatrics, you will be disappointed. He did not fidget. He did not scan the room. He did not look at the cameras. His folders were aligned with almost irritating precision, edges squared, tabs visible. This is the first thing you should notice. People who intend to perform chaos rarely organize their evidence this way. Before a single word is spoken, the power dynamic has already shifted. Here is what matters for you, the viewer. This is not a clash of ideologies. This is not left versus right. This is not Islam versus the West, or refugees versus natives, no matter how badly some people want it to be framed that way. This is about process, how decisions are made, who gets accelerated, who waits, who benefits, and who is allowed to criticize the system after extracting everything from it. Vance stands slowly, not dramatically, deliberately. The room quiets, not because he demands it, but because everyone senses that the script has been discarded. He begins not with accusation, but with acknowledgement. He praises Omar's journey, refugee camp, arrival at 12, naturalization, Congress before 40. He calls it remarkable. And it is. If you're watching, you should feel the dissonance here. This is not an attack. This is framing. Every good prosecutor starts by conceding the strongest point of the defense, and then he pauses. Not for effect, for alignment. This pause is for you, because the next question only works if you are already nodding along. He does not ask why she came. He does not ask whether she is grateful. He asks something colder, more structural. How? How did it happen so fast? This is where the hearing stops being symbolic and becomes forensic. On the screen behind him, a timeline appears. 2 columns. No commentary yet. Just dates. If you are watching and thinking, why does speed matter? This is the trap. Speed is everything in bureaucratic systems. Speed reveals pressure. Pressure reveals influence. The average Somali refugee in the early 1990s waited years. 3, 5, 7. Some waited a decade. Some are still waiting. Omar's family waited 8 months. This is not an opinion. It is a number. 8 months is not luck. 8 months is intervention. And here is the first thing Vance does that matters. He does not accuse her of wrongdoing. He does not say fraud. He does not say corruption. He lets the system indict itself. He walks you through the process step by step. UNHCR screening, U.S. agency referral, USCIS interviews, security clearances, medical exams, each stage normally separated by months, sometimes years. Then he shows you the file, every stage expedited, every bottleneck cleared, every delay erased. If you are still skeptical, good. You should be. Skepticism is healthy. That is why the next slide exists. Names, faces, other Somali families, same camps, same years, same dangers. Wait times measured not in months, but in childhoods lost. This is where the hearing quietly becomes something else. Not an indictment of Omar, but a mirror held up to a system that claims neutrality while rewarding proximity. And now the question changes. Not, did you break the law, but what did you do with the advantage? This is where the story stops being about immigration and becomes about entitlement. Vance does something subtle here. He turns away from Omar, not physically but rhetorically, and speaks to you. He explains why privilege among refugees is not the same as privilege among the wealthy. Refugee privilege is invisible. It hides behind suffering. It wears the same face. But it produces wildly different outcomes. Some families wait in tents for years. Others move into apartments with new furniture within 12 months. If this makes you uncomfortable, that's the point. Because the American dream is not offended by success. It is offended by dishonesty about how success is achieved. The hearing is still calm. No one is shouting. No one has been humiliated yet. But something has shifted. You can see it in the way Omar reaches for water a second time, in the way her counsel stops taking notes, in the way the activists in the gallery stop clapping on cue. This is no longer about telling a story. It is about answering for one. And as Vance closes the first folder, he does not end with an accusation. He ends with a question that hangs uncomfortably in the air, not just for Omar, but for you. If the system bent for you, if it moved faster for you, if doors opened that stayed closed for others, what obligation does that create? And more importantly, what happens when the person who benefited most becomes the loudest critic of the system that carried them? The room does not answer. The hearing does not answer. But the story has now been set. Because this was only the first folder. If you are still watching, this is the moment the hearing stops being about how someone arrived in America and becomes about how they stayed, and why process matters more than personal narrative when power enters the picture. The vice president does not open the next folder right away. He lets the silence do the work. This is not hesitation. It is calibration. The kind prosecutors use when they know the next material changes the temperature of the room. Here is the shift you should notice as a viewer. The questions are no longer about history. They are about compliance, not gratitude, not ideology. Compliance. Because systems don't care about intentions. They care about paperwork. Vance turns slightly toward the camera, not enough to break decorum, but enough to acknowledge that the real audience is not seated in the gallery. It's you. And he tells you, calmly, almost clinically, what this section is about. Citizenship pathways are not symbolic. They are transactional. Marriage-based status, tax filings, residency declarations, each one is a sworn statement. Sworn. Each one is a claim to the federal government that says, "This is true, and I accept the penalties if it is not." That is the frame. Not scandal, not morality. Transactional truth. He begins with a timeline. Not accusations, dates. The screen fills with them, evenly spaced, mercilessly clean. Years march forward without commentary, which is exactly why they matter. A religious marriage recognized within a community. A legal marriage recognized by the state. Children born during one relationship. Paperwork filed during another. If you're thinking, this is private, pause there. Because the moment personal arrangements intersect with federal benefits, they stop being private. That's not politics. That's law. Vance doesn't say this explicitly. He doesn't have to. He simply explains how marriage-based immigration works. Evidence required. Shared residence. Joint finances. Public presentation of a shared life. The system assumes fraud unless the applicant proves legitimacy. That is the rule, whether anyone likes it or not. Then he shows you what was filed. And here is where the structure of the narrative tightens. Because the documents don't scream. They whisper. Quietly. Persistently. They show what is present and what is missing. No shared leases where they would normally exist. No joint bank accounts during the relevant period. No photographic record of a shared domestic life. No corroborating affidavits filed at the time. Instead, a parallel domestic reality unfolds elsewhere, one that appears consistently in tax filings, school records, hospital forms, social media posts. Different name, same address, same years. This is the moment where the hearing stops being comfortable for everyone involved. Vance does not say the word fraud. He never needs to. He does something more effective. He reads the statute aloud, slowly, without inflection, like a metronome, knowingly entering a marriage for the purpose of evading immigration laws. He lets it trail off, not because he forgot the rest, but because you already know how statutes end, with penalties. Now, notice something important. He does not accuse the witness of committing the crime. He says something far more precise and far more dangerous. These are the exact circumstances investigators are trained to look for. That sentence matters, because it shifts responsibility away from the speaker and onto the system. He is not judging. He is explaining how enforcement works. If you are watching and thinking, but why hasn't this been investigated before? That is the right question, and it is exactly the one the hearing is designed to provoke. Because power often delays scrutiny. Visibility shields. Politics complicates enforcement. The timeline continues. Tax filings that contradict marital status. Corrections issued years later. Small repayments framed as clerical errors. This is where Vance slows down again. He explains something you are not supposed to know unless you have lived inside enforcement systems. Minor corrections are not minor because of the amount. They are minor because they are admissions. Admissions that a sworn statement was inaccurate. The amount doesn't matter. The declaration does. If the first section was about privilege, this section is about pattern. Not one mistake, not one misunderstanding. A sequence of decisions that consistently benefited one direction. And then, only then, does he introduce motive. Not greed, not malice. Incentive. Because immigration systems reward speed and simplicity. They are not designed to untangle complex personal arrangements. They rely on honesty. When honesty fractures, the system cannot correct itself without outside pressure. This is the quiet accusation, not that someone lied once, but that the system trusted, and trust was exploited. The room is tense now, but restrained. No shouting, no gasps, just the low hum of comprehension spreading through the audience. If you feel unsettled, good. This is where the story wants you. Because the next folder is not about immigration, it is about money. Campaign money. And here is where the prosecutorial narration sharpens, because the stakes change. This is no longer about how someone entered the country or regularized their status. This is about what happens when political power meets donor funds. Vance tells you something campaigns rarely explain to voters. Most races, especially safe ones, have predictable spending curves. Digital consulting, media, field operations, all of it follows industry norms. He shows you those norms. Then he shows you the deviations. A consulting firm receiving payments far above market averages. A firm run by someone personally connected to the candidate. Services billed at premium rates in races without meaningful opposition. This is not illegal by definition. And Vance is careful to say that. Over and over. But then he adds the clause that changes everything. Unless those payments exceed fair market value for necessary services. Necessary. That word lands differently when you see the margins. When you see luxury travel expenses categorized as campaign consulting. When you see accommodations that look more like leisure than logistics. If you are watching and thinking, this feels familiar, that's because it is. Campaign finance violations rarely announce themselves as theft. They disguise themselves as consulting. Vance doesn't accuse. He compares. Average spending versus actual spending. Competitive races versus safe seats. Standard rates versus billed rates. He lets the viewer connect the dots. And then, quietly, he mentions something you might have missed if you weren't paying attention. Multiple watchdog groups, ideologically opposed to each other, have flagged the same patterns. That matters, because when left and right watchdogs agree, it usually means the numbers don't care about politics. The hearing has changed tone again. The earlier sections asked whether advantage was earned. This section asks whether power was monetized. And beneath it all, a single theme keeps surfacing. Systems assume good faith. They function only when it exists. They collapse when it doesn't. Vance closes the folder without flourish. He doesn't summarize. He doesn't editorialize. He simply says this, and it is directed entirely at you. When the same individual benefits from accelerated immigration, ambiguous marital documentation, and inflated campaign expenditures, the question is no longer about any single act. It is about whether the rules mean the same thing for everyone. That sentence hangs in the air longer than any accusation could. Because now the story is no longer about a person. It is about a threshold. At what point does explanation become excuse? At what point does complexity become camouflage? And at what point does the system owe the public not a conclusion, but an investigation? The gavel has not fallen. The witness has not been dismissed. No verdict has been reached. But something irreversible has occurred. You now understand how privilege, paperwork, and power can align, and why accountability does not begin with outrage, but with receipts. And the heaviest folder has not been opened yet. If you are still watching, this is where the hearing stops being about documents and starts being about intent, because paperwork tells you what happened, but words tell you why. Up to this point, everything could still be dismissed as administrative ambiguity. Accelerated processing, unusual timelines, payments that raised eyebrows but lived in gray space. The kind of gray space Washington survives on. This is where that space narrows. Vance does not rush into this section. He explains, again to you, that elected power is not measured only by what someone does, but by what they say when they believe no one is listening closely. Votes are public. Speeches are archived. Social media never forgets. Patterns form whether the speaker intends them to or not. He frames the next folder with a sentence that sounds almost charitable. Criticism of government is not disloyalty. That line matters, because it disarms the easy defense. It acknowledges a truth most viewers already accept. Democracies require dissent. Protest is not betrayal. Debate is not hate. Then comes the pivot. But consistency reveals motive. The screen fills again, this time not with dates, but with quotes. Pulled from speeches, interviews, floor remarks, social posts. Each one cited, each one time-stamped, each one allowed to stand on its own. If you are watching and waiting for a single explosive sentence, you will miss the point. This section is not about one remark taken out of context. It is about repetition, about rhythm, about the same framing choices appearing again and again, even after backlash, even after explanation, even after apology. This is where narration becomes essential, because otherwise the viewer drowns in noise. Vance explains something every seasoned prosecutor understands. Language reveals default settings. People can correct themselves once, twice, but their baseline returns under pressure. He starts with how Israel is discussed. Not geopolitics, not borders, not policy disputes, but framing. He shows you how critiques are constructed differently depending on the target. When discussing authoritarian regimes, the language is technical. When discussing Israel, the language becomes moralized, hypnotized, bought, controlled, dual loyalty implied, if not always stated. Vance does not accuse the speaker of hatred. He does something more precise. He explains why certain phrases carry historical weight, why they land differently, why communities hear echoes that others miss. This is not about intent. It is about effect. Then come the votes. Not selectively chosen. Comprehensive. Every resolution touching on Israel is listed. Defensive systems, condemnations of terror, statements of legitimacy, each one marked with how the House voted and how Omar voted. The pattern emerges slowly, which is exactly why it lands. Opposition to defensive funding, abstention on condemnation, resistance to language affirming legitimacy. Again, Vance does not editorialize. He contextualizes. He shows how rare these votes are, how bipartisan most of these resolutions were, how small the dissenting bloc was, and how consistently Omar appeared within it. If you are watching and thinking, maybe this is principled, that is fair. Vance acknowledges that possibility. He even says it out loud. Then he asks the question that collapses the defense. Why is this standard applied nowhere else? Why not China? Why not Iran? Why not regimes with documented atrocities? The votes appear. The contrast sharpens. Silence on some. Moral urgency on others. This is not proof of anything criminal. It is proof of selectivity. And selectivity in politics is not neutral. The room feels colder now, not emotionally, structurally. The kind of cold that sets in when people realize they are watching alignment, not coincidence. Then comes the moment that everyone remembers, whether they want to or not. The phrase, "Some people did something." Vance does not shout it. He does not play it for outrage. He treats it like evidence, because that is what it is. He explains why phrasing matters in moments of mass trauma. Why minimization, intentional or not, creates fracture. Why survivors hear erasure even when none is intended. He does not accuse the speaker of sympathy for terrorism. He does something more damaging. He asks why clarity was avoided, why specificity was softened, why, when pressed repeatedly over years, the same pattern emerged: contextualize, redirect, universalize. This is where narration matters most, because the viewer needs guidance. Vance tells you plainly, condemning an act is not the same as condemning an ideology, and condemning an ideology is not the same as condemning a faith. Those distinctions are critical and deliberately blurred when it is politically convenient. He shows examples: immediate condemnation of domestic extremism, immediate condemnation of white supremacy, immediate condemnation of political violence at home. But when asked about Islamist extremism, the language shifts. Root causes, grievances, context. The pattern is unmistakable. If you feel discomfort here, that is intentional. Because this section is not about ideology. It is about asymmetry, about which violences demand clarity and which are wrapped in analysis. Vance pauses again, long enough for you to sit with it. Then the hearing moves into its most dangerous territory: loyalty, not in the crude sense, not accusations of treason, not "go back where you came from," none of that. He defines loyalty operationally. Where do you spend political capital? Who do you advocate for when no cameras are rolling? Which governments receive your attention, your access, your effort? Your travel records appear. Meetings. Photographs in government buildings abroad. Public praise. Quiet advocacy. Again, the narration is careful. He explains reporting requirements, disclosure rules, why they exist. Not to prevent contact, but to ensure transparency. Missing disclosures matter not because of where someone went, but because of what was discussed. If you are watching and thinking, "This feels like overreach," pause there. Because the standard is not moral, it is procedural. Lawmakers are required to report foreign official meetings for a reason. He connects the dots without drawing conclusions. Trips followed by legislative advocacy. Meetings followed by funding support. Silence followed by praise. Not proof. Pattern. And then he does something unexpected. He introduces voices that are not his: Somali-American veterans, business owners, refugees who arrived later, waited longer, worked harder. People whose lives contradict the narrative being sold on their behalf. They speak not in slogans, but in sentences. About gratitude, about identity, about choosing America not as a temporary refuge, but as a permanent allegiance. Vance steps back, literally and narratively. He lets them speak because their existence undermines the claim that criticism equals courage. These are people who criticize America when necessary, but still call it home without qualification. If you are watching and wondering why this matters, here is the answer. Because representation carries symbolic weight. When one voice claims to speak for many, dissent within that group becomes invisible. The hearing has now crossed a line. It is no longer about Omar's personal choices. It is about whether power has insulated her from accountability, whether narrative has replaced scrutiny, whether grievance has become currency. Vance closes the folder without drama, and then he says something that reframes everything that came before. The question is not whether you are allowed to criticize America. The question is whether you do so from a position of responsibility or resentment. That sentence lands harder than any accusation, because now the viewer understands what is at stake. Not punishment, not removal, but trust. The trust that systems extend. The trust voters assume. The trust that allows power to operate without constant verification. The room is quiet again, but it is not the quiet of tension. It is the quiet of recognition. And there is one folder left, the one no one wants opened, the one that forces a choice not of policy, but of memory. If you are still watching, understand this. The final folder was never about policy, or money, or even loyalty in the political sense. It was about memory, about what a nation refuses to forget, and what it will not allow to be minimized. Vance does not introduce it with a warning. He does not soften the transition. He simply tells you that this part is unavoidable, because some moments are not negotiable. They do not belong to parties, ideologies, or identities. They belong to the dead. He explains, again, directly to you, that September 11th is not a rhetorical device. It is not a metaphor. It is a historical event with names, bodies, and consequences that still shape the architecture of American life. Airport security, surveillance law, war, immigration screening. The very systems discussed earlier in this hearing were rebuilt on that morning. Then he plays the clip, not to provoke outrage, to establish record. You hear the words as they were spoken, casual, abstracted. Some people did something. If you are watching and thinking, I've heard this before, that's because you have. The phrase went viral years ago. It sparked anger, then fatigue, then silence. It became background noise until now. Vance does not react immediately. He lets the clip end. He lets the quiet stretch. And then he does something no one in the room expects. He begins listing names, not all 2,977, just enough. Enough to shatter abstraction. A firefighter who ran up the stairs while others ran down. An office worker who called home one last time. A flight attendant who tried to keep passengers calm while knowing there would be no landing. He tells you where he was that morning, not as a claim to authority, but as proof that memory is personal before it is political. Everyone remembers where they were. That is what national trauma does. It imprints. Then he explains why phrasing matters. Some people removes agency. Did something removes intent. Those two choices, combined, turn murder into mishap. This is not a semantic argument. It is moral math. When language erases perpetrators, it shifts attention away from accountability. When it universalizes blame, it dilutes responsibility. When it reframes victims as collateral to a broader narrative, it robs them of singular loss. Vance does not accuse Omar of sympathy for terrorism. He says something more unsettling. He says the phrasing reveals prioritization. That in the moment where clarity mattered most, the instinct was not to name the act, but to preempt the reaction. Not to center the dead, but to center the consequences for a specific community. He tells you plainly, protecting civil liberties is necessary. It always has been. But it is not incompatible with naming the crime that triggered the response. Those two truths are not opposites unless someone makes them so. The hearing shifts again, not through shouting, but through testimony. People stand, not as props, as witnesses. A firefighter who lost 6 colleagues. A widow holding a photograph taken months before the towers fell. A survivor who carries burn scars decades later. They are not here to debate ideology. They are here to correct the record. They do not ask for policy changes. They ask for words. Say what happened. Say who did it. Say it mattered. The room feels smaller now, as if the walls have moved inward. Because there are moments where neutrality becomes avoidance, and avoidance becomes offense. Omar offers condolences. That is not enough. Because condolences without acknowledgement feel hollow. Because grief demands recognition before reconciliation. When pressed, not by Vance, but by the weight of memory, she cannot say the words. Islamic terrorism. You may feel a tightening in your chest here. That is normal. This is where viewers diverge. Some believe naming ideology fuels prejudice. Others believe refusing to name it enables repetition. Vance does not resolve that debate. He reframes it. He asks why condemnation is selective, why some ideologies are named instantly and others are wrapped in context, why domestic extremism is confronted head-on while foreign extremism is intellectualized, why clarity is celebrated in some cases and feared in others. This is not about Islam. He makes that explicit. Millions of Muslims condemn terrorism unequivocally. Many died in those towers. Many serve in uniform. Many fled the same extremism that struck America, which makes the refusal to name it even more confusing. He shows you examples again. Condemnations issued swiftly for other attacks. Language sharp, moral lines clear. Then he shows you the contrast. Deflection, qualification, silence. If you are watching and thinking, this feels like a loyalty test. Pause there. Because loyalty is not the point. Responsibility is. Vance explains that public officials inherit collective memory along with power. They do not get to rewrite it. They do not get to sand down its edges to avoid discomfort. Their obligation is not to soothe. It is to preserve truth. And then he stops presenting evidence. No more documents. No more clips. No more charts. Because this is the part where the prosecutor steps back and lets the viewer decide. He asks a single question, not to Omar, but to you. What does it mean to be entrusted with authority in a country built on trauma you did not personally experience, but now represent? Is it enough to speak for communities that feel harmed? Or does responsibility require honoring the harm that built the system you now critique? The room is silent, not theatrically, but finally. You can feel that something has ended. Not a career, not a hearing, an illusion. The illusion that accountability can be postponed indefinitely. The illusion that narrative always outruns record. The illusion that grievance excuses obligation. Vance closes the final folder. He does not declare victory. He does not demand consequences. He does not raise his voice. He says the simplest thing he has said all day. History doesn't need us to agree with it. It needs us to tell it accurately. Then he sits. The gavel falls eventually. The hearing adjourns. People leave. Cameras cut away. Headlines form. But if you are still watching, you know the real outcome was never procedural. The outcome is that you were shown how systems bend, not because of conspiracy, but because of comfort. How scrutiny fades when narratives are protected. How accountability returns only when someone is willing to line up the receipts and speak plainly. This was not about refugees, or Muslims, or conservatives, or progressives. It was about whether power owes truth anything at all. And now, the question belongs to you. Not whether you agree with every argument, not whether you like the messenger, but whether you believe memory should be negotiable. Because if it is, then nothing else matters. And if it isn't, then accountability is not cruelty. It is duty.